Okay, thank you. So to introduce myself, I'm Almuth Ernsting, and I work with a campaigning organization called Biofuels. We are based in the UK and the US, and we've been looking at researching and campaigning against large-scale industrial bioenergy since 2006. Initially focused exclusively on industrial biofuels or agrofuels, but increasingly also looking at the use of biomass for heat, and especially in the electricity sector in Europe and in the US. We're also the European focal point of the Global Forest Coalition, which is a coalition of, it's an international coalition of NGOs and civil society organizations and indigenous peoples organizations campaigning against the underlying drivers of deforestation and degradation of forests, and for the rights of indigenous peoples and other forest-dependent peoples. Right, so to start, in my presentation, I'm really going to look at I'm going to look a bit more broadly at the impact of industrial bioenergy, not just biofuels for transport, on land and food, and more broadly on communities and on the climate. Now, to start off with, here's a table from one academic paper published in the United States. This is about the land footprint of different types of energy. Now, what you can see from that is that compared to other types of energy, biofuels for transport and biomass for electricity have by far the largest footprint, which means by footprint I mean the area of land required to generate a set unit of energy. Other types of energy classes, renewables, such as wind and solar, still, they still require more land than fossil fuels, which is very, very concentrated. Very concentrated in terms of energy, but there's really no comparison. I mean, bioenergy is if you look at wind, way down there compared to industrial bioenergy. Now, the problem we have is that Europe at the moment has, we've got the 2020 20% renewable energy target across Europe, with a separate 10% target for transport. And the transport target is expected to be 90% met from biofuels at least. And the overall renewable energy target is expected to be met primarily way over 50% from bioenergy in general, both biofuels, but also to a very large extent from burning wood. So the real problem we have is that when we're speaking about a shift to renewables, most people have in mind wind turbines and solar panels, but actually the big majority of it is burning stuff and burning biomass in some form or another. And the big problem with that, evidently, is that we are speaking that the prime choice that Europe, and yes, I mean, I'm speaking about Europe, that Europe is making in terms of renewables is for the type of energy which has an extraordinarily large land footprint compared to the energy that it can generate. So I get back to that in the conclusion, but that really raises, big questions over the direction in which renewable energy policy has been going and the direction in which it has been supported. Now, why is the land footprint of bioenergy so inherently high? Just quite briefly, the fundamental problem with trying to replace fossil fuels with bioenergy is that the amount of solar energy that's converted to energy in plants is very, very small. It's on average in crop plants, it's between 1% and 2%. And if you look for basically maximizing photosynthesis, the efficiency of photosynthesis, we have to maximize the inputs of water. Use the best soil, the richest soil with the most nutrients and with the most either irrigation or the best rainfall conditions, and it's also constrained by temperature. And essentially, the biosphere relies on recycling energy, not creating energy. Recycling energy as well as nutrients and water. And actually, if the world was in a stable state, you would have the overall amount of carbon added to the newly sequestered by the biosphere, whole biosphere as a whole, would tend towards zero. So it's inherently not a very feasible approach to replace fossil fuels, which are, well, I think one article called the fossilized sunlight from millions and hundreds of millions of years with plants growing on an annual basis or growing today. Now, a little bit about the yields, the yield issues. I think, by the way, I have to apologize. I think the EU figure is probably I missed out a decimal point there. But the overall trend has been on cereal yields in the 5 biggest cereal growing regions of the world: the US, EU, China, India, and Russia. Over the between 2009 and 2012, we've actually seen per hectare yield decreases in 3 out of the 5 regions. Which is the US, the EU, and Russia, and quite starkly, especially in the US, on a really, neatly downward curve. And I'm mentioning that because basically all the more optimistic bioenergy scenarios rely on ongoing yield increases. And as this shows, that's a very, very optimistic assumption. Also, it's worth keeping in mind that the optimistic bioenergy scenarios on which, to a large extent, EU's bioenergy policies are based rely primarily on dedicated energy crops, on turning land over to grow crops and trees exclusively for energy. There's a lot of talk about using agricultural so-called wastes and residues and forestry and agricultural waste and residues. But virtually all the studies, agree that this would be really a minority. The potential is very, very limited. Some studies would say even more so than this particular one. And there are problems with that, such as soil erosion, that we can maybe might come up in the discussion with a focus on residues. So we're primarily speaking about land use. Now, we've already from previous speaker heard about the direct competition with food. One recent study showed that in 2010, if you just look at the corn ethanol in the US and sugarcane ethanol from Brazil, you're looking at 6% of global crop production by mass and 4% of global calories produced. In the US, about 40% of corn or maize goes towards ethanol. Oh, that's a typo there. In the EU, 2/3 of vegetable oil production goes towards biodiesel. And in Germany, over 800,000 hectares of land goes towards growing maize for biogas. The effect on food prices has been really major, and there was a high-level panel of experts report on price volatility in food security in 2011, which showed that without the demand for biofuels, the global growth rate in cereal and vegetable oil consumption would actually have slowed down over the decade from 2000 to 2010. And it's biofuels which pushed up the growth rate for both, and the figures are starkest for vegetable oils, which means that biofuels really already have had a major disproportionate impact on food prices. Disproportionate, I mean, compared to the amount of energy we actually gain by them. According to the IEA, we currently 30 million hectares of land are used to grow crops for biofuels, directly for biofuels. However, despite this vast area of land and the huge impact on food prices, biofuels still only account for 2.7% of global transport fuels. It's really a drop in the ocean. It's also looking more broadly at land grabbing, which Genevieve has spoken about. It's important to note that the impacts go way beyond actual land grab actually to grow biofuel crops for Europe. And the starkest statistic for that is from ActionAid, who found that 6 million hectares of land had been acquired by European companies or EU companies in Africa with a stated reason of growing biofuels to supply the EU. However, virtually no biofuels are actually imported by the EU from Africa. So what we're looking at is that the demand for biofuels has been used on a really massive scale to justify land grabs, many of them of a purely speculative nature, and there isn't necessarily a neat link between land grabbing and actual biofuel supplies, i.e. the speculative impact, the impact on land worldwide, have gone far beyond actual biofuel production. This is a report you can find on our website about it that was done by the people from a Brazilian organization called CEPEDES and the World Rainforest Movement, who looked at recent land grabbing in Maranhão state in Brazil. In this case, not for liquid biofuels, but partly justified by Europe's growing demand for wood pellets. And a case where in those regions people are where large numbers of communities are fighting against being evicted and having their food sovereignty destroyed, and against the deforestation of the country. Those are basically traditional communities that heavily depend on the forests of the savanna forests, on fruit-growing trees, on small-scale cattle ranching, and really living off the land, and who are now threatened by really massive-scale eucalyptus plantations, partly justified by Europe's wood pellet demands. Here's a really stark statistic. Well, it's a forecast found in a study published in 2009. About what will happen if if Europe and basically global governments worldwide, adopt policies to replace fossil fuels increasingly with bioenergy. In this case, the assumption was that there would be a global carbon tax that would ignore the emissions from bioenergy and from agriculture and forests, and only put a carbon tax on fossil fuels. And what they predict is that by the second half of the century, there'll be effectively no natural forests left, no natural ecosystems of any description, no pasture, and a massive squeezing of really everything that is not industrial agriculture and forestry, massively focused on energy production. So it's a very, very grim forecast of what will happen by the ongoing promotion of bioenergy. Now, there's been a lot of talk by governments and within the EU, about how we can supposedly solve the problem or solve the negative impacts of bioenergy production with standards. So I thought I'd just mention those briefly, why we believe that standards are really not the answer. The first reason is that they haven't worked. The EU has introduced certain very limited standards, completely ignoring land rights, completely ignoring the right to food, but exclusively focusing on emissions and deforestation, or almost exclusively. And basically saying that we won't support biofuels that come from, for example, the conversion produced, say, from palm oil from recently deforested land. Now, all the evidence we have seen is that there's really zero evidence of any enforcement. There's no enforcement mechanism in place, and at a time where, despite the so-called EU standards, we've seen a massive increase in palm oil imports from Indonesia and Malaysia, at the same time as deforestation in both countries for palm oil has accelerated. The other issues are that standards can only address the direct impact of biofuels. They can't address the indirect impact. They certainly couldn't have done anything, any standards couldn't have addressed the 6 million hectares of land grabbed in the name of EU biofuels in Africa, because those are indirect impacts. There's no agency, there's absolutely no agency that can enforce any standards, however limited they are. If there was any regulatory enforcement of standards at the moment, it would be challenged under the WTO and potentially in future if the free trade agreements or the new free trade agreements that are being negotiated are signed. And effectively, when you're speaking of standards, we really just speak of something that only really exists on paper and makes no discernible difference on the ground. So, quick conclusion, feel that industrial bioenergy, would conclude, has a disproportionately large land footprint compared to the energy generated. Therefore, really the impacts on land, food, water, ecosystems, on the climate and on communities are also disproportionately large compared to energy gains. No. And the only credible way to stop the harm caused by industrial biofuels and increasingly by biomass is certainly in Europe to stop the government mandates, target subsidies that exist to basically remove the artificial incentives and really review change renewable energy policies to go towards, to promote types of renewable energy that really are genuinely low carbon and sustainable and don't have that type of disproportionate impacts that industrial bioenergy has.
Thank you very much.